Okay, so tonight my talk has a lot of different things kind of shooting in from different angles. So I'm going to try to pace myself as I go through it. It's a little different flavor than what you've seen tonight already, it has to be said. Okay, so I know I'm the last speaker, and probably your attention spans are probably starting to wane a little bit, but I'll try to be as brief as I can. Okay, it's all about developing self-leadership within creative teams. So as Evelyn was saying, with regards to, I suppose, a personal background, I have my own personal experience as a performer. I mentioned this morning that once upon a time I did competitive athletics, and I played in a band and all sorts of things requiring me to be on stage for bits and pieces. And this sort of led into a lot of different experience, a lot of different types of performers. In particular, the point being that it's a broad range of performance, and that really has spurred my interest and passion for performance psychology in particular. So she mentioned a few different folks that I worked with and whatnot. And one of the things that I became more and more interested in is what is it that I could learn from working with some of the people that were the best in their field. And things that I took away from it are essentially what makes some organizations better than others at cultivating creativity and leadership. That leads me to the topic of tonight's talk, which is developing self-leadership within creative teams, and specifically, what can an organization do to enable creativity and leadership within a team? What does this require of its employees? And what special considerations does the digital and tech sector have? This picture kind of encapsulates essentially self-belief. That's the reason I put it in here, and self-belief is integral to the whole self-leadership process, as I'm going to explain in a moment. So this morning I touched upon something called the multiplier effect, which has to do essentially with self-belief, motivation, and confidence. One of the things that that last slide demonstrates, obviously, is that top performers must fail repeatedly, and there's a reward within that process. That touches on what we call intrinsic motivation, which we talked about in more detail this morning, but essentially intrinsic motivation has to do with something that's inherently personally rewarding. It isn't about external rewards, which we would consider more external. This practice of improvement fulfills an inner need and spurs creativity. That's the key point. I mentioned this morning as well that Google actually has done a big data study on success factors and found that loving to learn and relearn was the key factor with predicting success. So I hope you can see how that ties in with intrinsic motivation. This brings me to something I like to call the cycle of self-belief. So this is essentially about the interrelationship between motivation, performance, and creativity. In particular, I wanted to talk about something I like to call the art of leadership, and how this relates in particular to leaders within different organizations. One of the things that I noticed time and time again, and research shows this as well, is that the expectation of being judged tends to reduce creativity within individuals. So there's important consideration about the balance between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And also, is the feedback that employers and people in leadership roles constructive? Is it tend to be work-focused, and is it non-threatening? These obviously are subjective parameters, so it can get a little bit complicated in a hurry. How does motivation relate to creativity? I mentioned before, excessive rewards, as we might consider to be extrinsically associated with extrinsic motivation, can lead actually to a decrease in intrinsic motivation. For example, a common reward for somebody who's doing very, very well in the workplace is to offer them more money, or perhaps more responsibility, and often less freedom. Extrinsic motivators that reinforce intrinsic ones are often helpful, though. So it's not that we're trying to entirely avoid extrinsic motivation, but examples such as recognition that confirms competence, or even there's an example that within a lot of workplaces these days, you've probably heard about the 20%, the idea of basically you give people 20% freedom on their time as a reward actually for productivity or effectiveness. Intrinsic motivation often develops over time. This is another key component, okay? So a lot of times people actually need an external motivator to keep that motivation moving forward. And often developing that intrinsic motivation is actually the key consideration. So let's talk a little bit about creativity then and how organizations can help foster that. There's a bit of a mystique around creativity. Okay, and one of my favorite philosophers, I like to call him Neil Young. I'm sure you you recognize that his last name isn't spelled that way, but I like to combine things sometimes. So, this is one of my favorite quotes I've read one of his books, is that accessing creativity is like approaching a wild animal in a hole. You consistently stay there with it and wait for it to come out. And I think we see this all the time in nature, actually. Common team issues. Let's relate this actually to essentially the topic of the entire discussion this week, is how does it relate particular to the digital and tech sector. There's different teams, obviously, within lots of organizations. First being engineering and development. Well, often engineers, they're not necessarily focused on the value to the customer. Marketing and sales teams are more aligned towards the consumerization of technology and developing the brand promise. And then lastly, operations and delivery are all about delivering on that marketing promise. So you can see that they have often different goals and ideals, and they speak different languages as well. The techies talk tech speak, or geek speak, sometimes referred to. Marketing talk about value propositions, and in particular, operations talk about how to configure it for the end user. So how do we create team synergy both between and within these different teams? It's basically three tenets: knowledge, communication, and leadership. Let's talk for a moment about knowledge in particular. Tacit knowledge has to do with know-how. Okay, it's not about procedures. And the key characteristic, this is a key characteristic rather, of team-based learning. In particular, organizational knowledge is often produced and held collectively, often within tight-knit groups within an organization. So the way those two actually interrelate is that adaptive expertise is often demonstrated by new solutions to problems and new procedures for solving them. And that obviously is dependent upon organizational and tacit knowledge largely. Communication. How do we get these different team members to actually talk to one another? There's obviously a movement these days towards actually creating space for people to connect and connecting people to enable to think together and share insights, and that's largely what that's about, is sharing that tacit or organizational knowledge. Collaboration leads to confidence, okay? A lot of people actually, that confidence that comes from collaboration is the thing that actually can end up motivating them further. And ensuring that learning becomes organizational knowledge. Lastly, leadership. In particular, I just like to frame it in terms of leadership in the 21st century. We're moving more and more away from this sort of command and control types of leadership styles. And what's becoming more and more prominent is emergent leadership, or not necessarily appointed or elected positions in this regard, but it develops as a result of that group interaction. Secondly, adaptive leadership. And this is important in terms of how different team leaders actually connect with one another in terms of distributed leadership, having the right mix, having enough trust, and having clear roles within them. So going back to the art of leadership for a moment, creativity requires both an intense focus and often an incubation. I don't know if any of you have really sat down with what might be deemed a very creative endeavor, but you probably have found that after about 3 or 4 hours, the output versus the effort starts to wane. Okay, and that's a little bit that's what this tries to take advantage of or capitalize on in terms of an idea of that incubation period. Also, intrinsic motivation and passion will develop within the right conditions, some of those conditions which I've mentioned already. And people are the source of ideas. There's often this sort of dichotomy between what's more important, the ideas or the people? Well, actually, the people are the source of the ideas. So in terms of organizations capitalizing most effectively on that, focus on their talents, and in particular their work habits. something I like to call empowerment for effectiveness. And this comes down to sort of this is my bullet point strategy in terms of summing up. Trust in people and not the process. Okay, you hear this, trust in the process, but actually you're relying on people, not necessarily processes and procedures. Get the team performing as individuals and as a team, but you have to trust them to do that. Encourage people to focus on innovations rather than credit. And hoping you can see how that is interdependent with respect to the intrinsic motivation, the creativity. Lastly, I'll try to tie this together with a few bullet points in my view. Self-leadership is about autonomy, it's about trust, and it's about vulnerability from both sides, actually, with respect to employers and employees, with respect to leaders and followers. Creativity is not a genie in a bottle waiting to be unleashed, but rather it's a process, it's a habit, it's a mindset and a value, and for me, it's a necessity. And it's not privy to a special few. I encourage organizations to create leaders and let them own their own future. This is obviously has been supported by some of the speakers already tonight, and even Evelyn when she started the talk tonight about her own experience working with Catalyst Creative. Thank you very much for listening.